In this lesson, we'll finish developing our main menu by adding our functionality.
This video is brought to you by the Astor Galaxy Game Room project and course, a tutorial series filled with hours of content and professionally developed 3D models, textures, and 2D sprites. In this course, we will not only take you step by step through things such as creating game systems and mechanics, but also how to use and master lighting and rendering in Unity's various render pipelines. To instantly gain access to hours of high-quality tutorials, professional level game assets, and much more, click the link in the description and begin your journey to creating the next great game today.
Let's begin by creating two game objects, and we'll call one Game, and we'll call the other Astor Galaxy Main Menu SM. And let's also add a state machine, then create a macro for our Main Menu SM game object. Let's first create two scene graph variables, one for our Main Menu game object, and one for our game object. Before we begin, let's first go over the logic that we want to implement within our state machine. Since all of our elements are already animated, in our state machine we'll simply be controlling the time in which our logo and our button animations play. The easiest way to do this is to simply deactivate, then activate the object when it's time for that object's animation to play. With that in mind, let's go into our start state. Currently, even though we have an option button present, our start button will be the only button that's functional. Let's start by creating 4 object graph variables. We'll create one for our menu logo game object, one for our menu button game object, and one for our start button, and one for our option button. Let's next set the variable type, then use the objects in our scene to set the values. Our menu logo object and our button logo object will both be game object type variables, and our start button and our option button will both be UI button type variables. We'll start our graph with the start event, and then we'll use a setActive node to deactivate our scene game variable, then use another setActive node to activate our main menu scene variable. We'll also deactivate both our menu logo object as well as our menu button object. With that complete, let's create 3 flow states, and we'll call one menu logo, the second menu buttons, and the third play game. Let's now make a transition from our start to our menu logo state. Within our transition, we'll simply use an onEnterState event node, then a wait for seconds node before going to our state trigger transition. This way we can have a brief pause before the logo begins to appear in our menu. Let's now go into our menu logo state. In our menu logo state, we'll begin by setting our menu logo object to active. We next want to use a wait for seconds node to trigger a custom event, which will trigger our transition to our next state. However, we want the duration of our wait for seconds node to be the length of our logo animation. In order to get this information, we could go back into our animator, but let's use a more efficient way to get our animation time. In order to do this, we can get our animation component from our menu logo object variable, and then use an animator get animation controller node and a animator controller get animation clips node. Since this was created to store all the clips in our animation controller, we'll need to use a list get item node in order to isolate the clip we want to use. Since there's only one animation clip in this controller, we can keep the index at 0 And lastly, we'll need to use an animator clip getLink node. And we'll plug its output into our wait for seconds node duration input. Let's now create a transition from our menu logo state to our menu button state. And within this transition, we'll use our custom event that we created in our menu logo state. Let's go back to our menu logo state. Let's select and copy our nodes and groups. And we'll paste them in our menu button state. For this state, we'll simply change our menu logo object variables to our menu button object, as well as our custom event name. And let's create a transition from our main menu button state to our play game state. So let's start by creating an object graph boolean variable, which we'll call isMenuComplete. And we'll have our custom event set our isMenuComplete boolean to true, which will allow our player to start the game by pressing enter, which is the input we're using for the start key on our controller. The main reason we're doing this, instead of using an on-click event or a mouse down event, is because our game will be displayed on our TV, which means the player's mouse won't actually be able to interact with our game's menu. We'll next use a keyboard input event and set the key to our return or our enter key, or the key we use to trigger the start button on our game controller. We'll have that then go into a branch node, which will check and see if our isMenuComplete boolean true. If it's true, we can then transition to our play game state. With that complete, let's go into our start state. And we want to use a set variable node to make sure our isMenuComplete boolean is false. Lastly, let's copy our set active nodes and variables for our scene game object variable, as well as our scene main menu variable. And let's paste them in our playing game state. We'll set them on an on enter state. And we want to activate our game object variable, and we want to deactivate our main menu object variable. And for the sake of demonstration, let's also place an on button click event to trigger our play game state. With that complete, let's now test our functionality. If we go into our nodes, we can see that our wait time is set to 2.5 seconds. And by clicking on our animation, and if we look at our length, we can see that our length of our animation is also 2.5 seconds. We can also see that once we click our start button, our main menu is deactivated and our game object is now activated.
To instantly gain access to hours of high-quality tutorials, professional-level game assets, and much more, click the link in the description and begin your journey to creating the next great game today.